I just wanted to go over why I believe main conclusion question types are foundational for the LSAT logical reasoning section. And they are a foundational question because to really do well, I would say, on main conclusion question types and the LSAT in general, you have to understand what an argument is. And for the purposes of the LSAT, an argument consists of at least one premise and a main conclusion. Now, this is just the bare minimum for what an argument is. It has at least one premise or supporting fact and a main conclusion. But most of the time, there is more than one premise, and there can be sub conclusions that make up complex arguments. I won't go into complex arguments today because I just wanted to go over the foundation for arguments on the LSAT and main conclusion question types. But one should be aware that arguments can be complex and have intermediate conclusions that aren't the main conclusion but are used to support the main conclusion. So they almost function as a premise. But that isn't the point for today. The point is really to understand an argument on the LSAT consists of at least one premise and a conclusion. And to boil that down even further, an argument is just premises. I would say premises and a conclusion. This is the formula for an argument, and this is it is very simplest what an argument is. So to understand the LSAT logical reasoning section, you have to know what arguments are, and then you have to know what premises and conclusions are. Now, what exactly are premises and conclusions? Well, for purposes of the LSAT, a premise is something that it can be a fact, it can be a survey, a piece of evidence, or a statement used to support or persuade the reader to believe the conclusion. And the conclusion is something the author is trying to prove. Now, this may already seem intuitive, but differentiating between premises and conclusions is a key skill to do well on main conclusion question types in the LSAT in general, because sentences on the LSAT can get weird, can get they can maybe involve complex subject matter that you have no idea what you're reading. But if you can understand what is the author ultimately trying to get at, and to see beyond what the author is trying to say, and really why the author is saying it, why the author says you should believe fact, why the author says you should believe this fact over another, and it's because of XYZ. So if you can see the conclusion and you can see what's used to support the conclusion, you can really boil down those really tricky arguments that the LSAT consists of, and you can do better on the LSAT. And essentially, that's what a premise and conclusion is, and why I believe it is so foundational. Now, just to really illustrate a really simple case of premises and conclusions, in case someone hasn't understood it yet. So I can say as a premise and a conclusion, I can say I want to try to persuade people that all birds are, let's say all birds are cool. And why? Because birds can fly. So this is a pretty simple argument. My argument is that birds can fly, and that makes all birds, I would say, therefore, just to make it even more obvious, therefore, all birds are cool. Now, this really isn't a strong argument. Just because they can fly, why should believe they are cool? But this is basically a very simple structure of an argument, and without a premise and without this conclusion, the argument falls apart. So with just a premise, there's no argument. With just a conclusion, there's no argument. And we could possibly make this argument stronger by saying that any animal, I would say any bird, I would say any animal that can fly is cool. And we can make it even more stronger that birds that can fly and are animals. Yeah. So this makes it a strong argument. They can fly and they're animals. And we say that any animal that can fly is cool. Therefore, the birds are cool. This makes this makes the argument pretty strong, and so. But my point being is that sorry. My point being is that um, this is what an argument is. Now, the strength and validity of the argument is uh, uh, a whole nother topic that one needs to study to do on LSAT, which I won't get into today. But this, just off the top of my head, this is an argument. It's made out of a premise, multiple premises, and a conclusion. And an easy way to really differentiate what are premises and what are conclusions of the argument are when you read the sentence, and you ask yourself at the end of the sentence, does this sentence support another sentence? In that case, it would be a premise. But if the sentence is supported by other sentences, then that makes a conclusion. Another way to do this, another way to identify premises and conclusions, is to ask yourself simply why. You know, in the case of the birds example, why should I believe that all birds are cool? So why should I believe that? Well, that's because all animals that can fly are cool. All animals that can fly are cool. Now, by asking ourselves why, we already have separated what the conclusion is and what the premises are. Why should we believe that? Because that makes the premise all animals can fly are cool. And so that makes the conclusion that all birds are cool. So why should we believe this conclusion? Well, because of this premise. Now, there are even more ways to memorize what premises and where premises and conclusions appear. There are indicator words that one should be familiar with or memorize or at least be familiar with, but this is really a mechanical approach to understanding what premises and conclusions are, and foundational to main conclusion question types on the LSAT. Now, to really illustrate this point, we can go on, or excuse me, we can do a quick main conclusion question based on the June 2007 LSAT. So we can read the stimulus here. Double-blind techniques should be used whenever possible in scientific experiments. They help prevent the misinterpretations that often arise due to expectations and opinions that scientists already hold. And clearly, scientists should be extremely diligent in trying to avoid such misinterpretation. Which of the following most accurately expresses the main conclusion of the argument? Okay, so we obviously know that this is a main conclusion question type. So we're asked to find, what is the author trying to get at? What is the conclusion of the argument? Now, off the top, when I first read this, we can see that there's a recommendation here, should be, but that isn't a foolproof way because should be also appears in the last sentence. So we ask ourselves, we can use this approach. What sentences are supporting another sentence in the stimulus? Okay, let's start with the first sentence. Double-blind techniques should be used whenever possible in scientific experiments. Okay, why should we believe this? Well, first, they help prevent misinterpretations that arise during blah blah blah, and they also and also scientists should be diligent in avoiding such misinterpretations. Okay, now we see that these two statements, that scientists should avoid misinterpretations and that double-blind techniques prevent misinterpretations, supports this sentence that double-blind techniques should be used whenever possible. And we can see this. Why technique used? Why should we believe double-blind techniques should be used whenever possible? Well, they prevent misinterpretations, and scientists should avoid misinterpretations. That was a mechanical approach to understanding what the conclusion is here and what the premises are here. But to really understand what argument is getting at, one needs to be able to understand what conclusions are and what premises are. Because one could fall into the trap of saying, like, hey, conclusions usually appear at the last sentence. Clearly, scientists should be extremely diligent in avoiding such misinterpretations. Maybe that's the conclusion there, that they should be diligent. It's a recommendation. That's the conclusion. And the LSAT test takers, they know how test takers think. that most test takers, they think that conclusion usually appears at the end, right? We like to form a logical structure in our head where it's like, one leads to two, two leads to three, therefore three, right? So we think of it in a very structured way, and so we look here at the end, this is what the conclusion is going to be. But the LSAT test takers know this, so they deliberately try to trick you by putting these words like should be into the last sentence, where in fact main conclusion questions, the conclusion can appear anywhere. It can appear in the first sentence, it can appear in the middle, it can appear everywhere. And also the LSAT test takers will try to trick you with indicator words such as therefore, in conclusion, or I would say in conclusion, thus, these obvious indicator words that appear. They'll say a statement and therefore XYZ. But in main conclusion questions, these are seldom the right answers. These are seldom the main conclusions because these are most of the time intermediate conclusions, because the LSAT test taker is trying to trick you into selecting this answer choice. But that's a whole nother topic. Intermediate conclusions and complex arguments are a whole nother topic. Let's continue on this question. So we can start with A. Scientists' objectivity may be impeded by interpreting experimental evidence on the basis of expectations. That seems like a premise that is used to support the conclusion up here. So this is not right. It is advisable for scientists to use double-blind techniques in as high a proportion of the experience as they can. Well, this seems pretty good. This is saying that double-blind techniques should be used whenever possible. In as high as a proportion, mirrors this whenever possible language up here in their experience. So this seems reasonable. This is really what the author is trying to get at, that they should be used as often as possible or in highest proportion as possible. Essentially the same thing. Scientists sometimes neglect to adequately consider the risk of misinterpreting evidence on the basis of prior expectation. Okay, this is talking about misinterpreting evidence, but it's talking about scientists neglect to consider the risk of misinterpreting evidence. There's nothing really in the stimulus that we can base this answer choice on. There's really nothing that mentions that they neglect to consider the risk. This is a statement that cannot be inferred by the stimulus and ultimately is not what we're looking for in the main conclusion. So it's wrong. Whenever possible, scientists should refrain from interpreting evidence on the basis of previously formed expectations and convictions. This seems like a premise. This is saying that, scientists should not, this is saying what it's saying up here. They should prevent the misinterpretations to avoid misinterpretations. This is saying that, yes, they should be refrained from interpreting evidence previously formed. So this is, they're saying that they should avoid misinterpretations, which is the premise. So this is wrong. Double-blind techniques are often an effective way of ensuring scientific objectivity. This seems like a premise. This is really this is really supporting what the author is trying to get at. This really isn't what the author is getting at, that they should be used as often possible. This is really support, which makes it a premise. So this is wrong, which leaves B, which we really like, in its highest proportion, which means whenever possible, and it is the correct answer. So I went through that kind of quickly, but I was really trying to highlight my point being that main conclusion question types are essential for understanding the logical reasoning section, and you have to understand what makes up an argument. It's a premise and conclusion, and how do we identify premises and conclusions, and that is foundational for the LSAT. And in terms of the next level or the next steps or whatever, as I mentioned before, one needs to understand what complex arguments are, because these are often what appear on main conclusion question types. Intermediate conclusions, we have to understand what are intermediate conclusions. How do we determine how do we identify intermediate conclusions and be able to differentiate the difference between intermediate conclusions and main conclusions. So this is really the next level of the foundational skill of understanding main conclusion questions and premises and arguments on the LSAT.